Hi all, Dr. Clark here. Today we're going to jump into photosynthesis, and so I'm going to give kind of a brief overview of photosynthesis. Most of you probably have had a overview similar to this. Okay, so this will just be kind of a review of the basics of photosynthesis. Then we're going to go into a great deal of detail on how photosynthesis occurs, what are the components of photosynthesis, how it's driving the formation of carbohydrates and ATP and NADPH and these kind of things. Okay, so first though, just a general overview of photosynthesis. So here you can see this is a plant, cell wall. These are plant cells, and these little green organelles are chloroplasts, and that's the site of photosynthesis. Okay, and so we're going to come back and we'll talk about that. We'll also talk about these little guys here. These are guard cells, and this opening is called the stomata or stoma, and this area is where carbon dioxide is exchanged with the environment along with oxygen, and water is lost also. Okay, we'll come back to this in a little bit. So first of all, when we talk about photosynthesis, and we've already discussed this a few times in lecture, okay, that the majority of the energy that organisms are running on this planet is coming from photons. It's coming from sunlight. Okay? And so I would say probably 3/4 of the energy is exclusive to photosynthetic properties. 1/4 of the energy is probably coming from chemosynthesis, okay, and so chemical breakdown. We're not really going to spend much time on that in this course, but if you progress in marine biology and things like that, you'll probably hear about chemosynthesis a lot more. Okay, so we're going to concentrate though on that 3/4 of the energy, and that's really coming from the sun. And it's those photons from the sun are utilized by plants, algae, some bacteria, some protista. They have the ability to capture photons and convert that energy into carbohydrates. And that's the process by which we call photosynthesis. Okay? But interestingly enough, you'll probably hear about this a little more when we get into ecology and stuff like that, that only about 1 or 2% of the energy that comes to the planet is utilized by organisms in the form of photosynthesis. Okay? Probably 45% is reflected back, and the rest is absorbed in some way. Absorbed in ice, absorbed in rock, absorbed in water. Okay? These kind of things will absorb that extra energy. So a lot of it's reflected back off the planet, and only 1 or 2% is captured and converted. The energy is used to convert things like carbon dioxide into carbohydrates. Okay, so let's kind of give an overview of this. Most of you know that photosynthesis occurs in chloroplasts, which are specialized organelles inside the plant's leaf. Okay, it doesn't have to be the leaf of the plant though. I'll show you some examples of this later on, but things like, desert plants, like if you look at a cactus or something like that, the whole cactus is green. On a cactus, the spine, the things that poke you, that's the actual leaf of the cactus, okay? The body of the cactus is photosynthetic, so it doesn't have to be the leaf. Now, most often we're talking about the leaf that contains chloroplasts. So chloroplasts contain internal membranes. So inside the organelle chloroplast, they have these membranes which we often call thylakoid sacs. And if you take a bunch of these thylakoid sacs and you stack them together, we call that a grana or granum. And then the space in between the granum, okay, is called stroma. Now, these kind of terms are important to know because when we start diving into photosynthesis, I'll talk about protons moving into the thylakoid space or out of the thylakoid space, ATP being synthesized in the stroma, these different things. So I want to make sure that you know what I'm talking about when I talk about stroma, grana, thylakoid, that kind of stuff. So again, overview, photons, okay, are coming from the sun. Okay. They are captured by chlorophyll molecules inside the cell, inside the plant leaf. Okay. And we'll probably talk about some of the plant adaptations, like cuticle layer and things like that. And we'll talk about the mesophyll and the epidermis and things like that, and the stroma. But it's going to be much further along in the lectures when we start talking about some of these adaptations. Just note that photons are captured by chloroplasts. Specifically, they're captured by pigment or molecules, either chlorophyll molecules or accessory pigment molecules. And then the energy from that is utilized to combine carbon dioxide and water to make carbohydrates. Okay? And we'll look at that in a little bit. All right, so photosynthesis is broken up into what we call photosystems. There are two photosystems. There's photosystem 2 and photosystem 1, and that's the order in which they appear. Photosystem 2 is first, then photosystem 1. Okay, we can get into why that is later, but it's not all that important. Now, inside the photosystem, which is going to be inside the thylakoid membrane, or embedded in the thylakoid membrane, you're going to have pigment molecules. Okay? Now, the most abundant, most of the time, the most abundant pigment molecule is going to be a type of chlorophyll, either chlorophyll A or B. Okay, and these different types just mean that they have a little bit different properties. They can pick up photons at different wavelengths. Now, that's not to say that all plants that do photosynthesis have chlorophyll as their primary pigment. That's not true. Okay? So it definitely depends on the species of plant, what their primary pigment is. But most plants, if you look at them and they're green, then their primary pigment is chlorophyll. Okay? That pigment, and all the pigments for that matter, act as an antenna. So you can kind of think of it as like more like a dish, like a DirecTV dish. I don't know if they have dishes anymore, but whatever company has a dish, like a satellite dish. And you can think about it as a satellite dish, and it's out there and it's catching photons, okay? And it's capturing these photons, and it's passing the energy from one pigment molecule to the next. We call this resonant energy. And so that energy is passed around until the energy builds up enough that it can excite an electron. It can make an electron be picked up by an electron carrier. Okay? And we'll get to all this in just a little bit. Okay? Now, photosynthesis itself takes place in three main stages. The first stage is what I just explained. Photons being captured by this antenna complex. The second stage is to then use the energy from the photons to drive the production of ATP, okay? And also to utilize the free electrons from this situation, from this biochemical pathway, to form NADPH. Okay? NADPH is an electron carrier. It carries electrons to another region of the cell, or in this case, another region of the chloroplast. And then the final process is to use the products from these two reactions, okay, to drive the formation of carbohydrates. Okay? So you're utilizing, okay, ATP and NADPH to make carbohydrates, or chemical bonded energy. Okay, so you're using photons and converting photons into stored energy. Okay? That's really what the the process of photosynthesis is about. Okay. Furthermore, we can divide the whole thing in photosynthesis into two main systems, or two main types of reactions. Light-dependent reactions. Now these are reactions that occur in the presence of light. Often we think about light being sunlight, but you also have to think about plants that are growing in maybe a greenhouse or inside a person's home away from the windows. They can pick up photons, they can pick up energy from just overhead lights or special UV lights that you would see in a greenhouse. So that's still light dependent reaction though, and it's still the same kind of process. So it doesn't have to be photons from the sun. We can burn fossil fuels or capture photons and energy and then utilize that energy at a later date to drive lights to grow plants, and we do that often. But the other way is to just have this process happen during the day. And so ATP, NADPH is produced during the light-dependent reaction. The light-independent reaction, it can occur during the daytime or at night, when it's dark, when it's light, but it doesn't need photons for the light-independent reaction to occur. So it doesn't matter when it occurs, it's just not capturing photons for this process. Instead, what it's using is the products from this reaction, the light-dependent reaction, to drive products that are built in this reaction, the light-independent reaction. And so this is also known as the Calvin cycle, and it's just the production of carbohydrates by utilizing energy that has been produced during the light-dependent reaction. All right. So for the most part, we can describe photosynthesis by a very simple equation. And I want you to not just memorize this equation, but I want you to learn this equation, because when we start talking about cellular respiration is just the reverse of this equation. So if we look at the equation of photosynthesis, we can take in 6 carbon dioxide molecules, 12 water molecules, light energy, which is photons, and that's going to yield 1 molecule of glucose, C6H12O6, and 6 water molecules, and 6 oxygen molecules. Now, I want to just make sure that people understand, okay, that plants are not doing photosynthesis to produce oxygen. That is not why they're doing photosynthesis. Plants are doing photosynthesis so they can produce glucose. And in actuality, even though a lot of books and a lot of talks and a lot of information out there say that oxygen is a product of photosynthesis, they're missing a piece of that. Oxygen is actually a waste product of photosynthesis. Oxygen is poisonous to plants. And if there was an evolutionary way for plants to go through photosynthesis without producing oxygen, I assure you that would have evolved. Okay? It just happens to be that this process produces oxygen. It's a great quirk of evolution. It's an amazing quirk of evolution because it allowed for plants to oxygenate the planet so organisms like ourselves can live here. But in no way are plants making oxygen during photosynthesis. That is not the purpose of photosynthesis. The purpose of photosynthesis is glucose. And we'll go through why that is in a little bit, because if a plant does not open its stomata and release oxygen, it will kill the plant. So you know that oxygen is a toxin, just like carbon dioxide is a toxin to us. If we don't exhale carbon dioxide, okay, it will kill us. If plants don't exhale oxygen, it will kill them. Okay? And so we'll look at that in a little bit. Okay? So how do plants capture energy from the sun? All right. Now, you keep hearing me say photons, photons, photons. Photons are just packets of energy, light energy. Now, these photons come at very different energy levels, and they can look differently, and they can have different patterns and things like that, and they occur on a range of energy, and we can represent them in a range of energy called the electromagnetic spectrum, which we'll look at in a second. Now, we often think of light and energy and energy levels from just a human perspective. We think of things like, oh, well, we can perceive these colors, which we call visible light. But I want you to think about things a little bit differently. Yes, humans created science knowledge. And yes, we have lectures and we're the individuals, that are learning and things like that. That makes us very different than other organisms. But we need to stop thinking about things from just a human perspective. Visible light, it should be known as human visible light, because there are lots of organisms that see outside of our visible light range. And so if we look at the visible light range, our visible light range runs from 400 nanometers, about 390 actually, all the way to 750, 740. And so that doesn't mean that other organisms can't see outside this range. There's lots of organisms that see in the infrared range, above 750. There's lots of organisms that see in the UV range, below 400. So for us to say visible light, we really need to just talk about people. The human visible light range is this. And as we progress in the course, you're going to see a lot of situations where I'm like, well, it's named this, but that's because we didn't discover, other organisms and their abilities till much later on. Nonetheless, this visible light range will give us some idea of the range of energy that plants can pick up. So if you look up here, a photon can occur in different wavelengths, okay? And these wavelengths have different amounts of energy. And so a wavelength, in the 550 nanometer range is going to have a different amount of energy than the 740 and the 400. So we'll look at this in a little bit when we start talking about what pigments can absorb. So pigments are molecules that can absorb photons. And like I said before, the main pigment that we often see in plants is chlorophyll. And this is why we see plants as being green. Because chlorophyll can absorb light at the ends of our visible spectrum. So it can absorb light, photons from the, close to the infrared spectrum, out, 600 to 750 nanometers, and then it can absorb light from, about 500 down to maybe 375. Plants do absorb UV, so they do absorb light outside of our visible spectrum. And if you want to see this, or if you know anything about growing plants and whatnot, you know that you need a light bulb that produces UV photons if you're going to grow it inside. That's going to give you the best results. If you want to see this, you can just go to Home Depot and look at the lights that they're growing plants under and read the light, and it'll tell you what % is UV. And that's because plants utilize UV. It's actually a very strong energy source for plants, UV is. But nonetheless, this blue and red light spectrum is going to be absorbed, and the material that is reflected is why we see a certain color. Other plant pigments can absorb other light levels. So where chlorophyll cannot absorb green, so it doesn't absorb um, nanometers in that 550, 600 region. It's not absorbing those wavelengths. It's reflecting them back, and that's why we see green, and I'll talk about that in a second. But accessory pigments like xenophils and carotenoids and whatnot, they have the capability of absorbing outside the levels that chlorophyll do. So things like carotenoids, which are going to be red, they absorb everything except for the red part of the spectrum. So 650 to 750, somewhere in there. And then, xenophils are typically yellow or orange, so they're going to absorb the high ends of the spectrum and the lower ends of the spectrum, but in the yellow ends of the spectrum, the visible light spectrum, they're not going to absorb. They're going to reflect. And so when we look at different colors that we see in nature, whether that be the color of a flower or fruit or a vegetable or whatever color that we see, the pigments that we see are just a reflection of what photons are being reflected back. So if it's reflecting back red, then you know that's reflecting back, a high nanometer, somewhere in the, high 600s or, early 700 nanometer range of a photon. Now, we often forget that even if, you're looking at a red apple, which means that it absorbs a bunch of photons much lower on the visible light spectrum. When we look at the apple leaf, we often say, well, then it must just have chlorophyll. But that's not the case. And if you look at fall colors, this gives you a great example of this. A leaf will go from green to yellow, yellowish orange, to red, depending on the plant. And what you're seeing is green, chlorophyll is the most abundant pigment. Then that chlorophyll molecule starts to degrade. And what's left are xenophils, the yellow and orange color. And then the xenophils start to degrade. And what's left is the carotenoids. And you get that red pigment. And then the carotenoids start to dissolve or break down. And so leaves have accessory pigments. Now, depending on the leaf, depending on, what organism we're talking about, will depend on what kind of accessory pigments they have, how abundant are they, and whatnot. Okay? So here you can see why we see plants being green. Okay? Is that, all the wavelengths except for 500 to 600 nanometers is absorbed by the leaf. And it's that 500 to 600 nanometers, which is where green pigment is, okay, or the green photons are, and that's going to bounce back, hit our eyes, and we're going to perceive the plant as being green. So here's just a graph of absorption, an absorption spec of chlorophylls versus carotenoids, and you can see that carotenoids and chlorophylls are really good at absorbing things way down here in the lower, nanometer wavelengths, all the way out even to the 350. They can absorb those things. Okay? And then not so good in the 550 range, especially the chlorophylls. The chlorophylls are going to be green. And then again, if it's a carotenoid, it's not going to pick up very much out here either, because carotenoids are red. But the chlorophylls A and B will pick up here on this red spectrum. Okay? And we'll look at this again when we start talking about specific examples of plants and the absorption those plants have. And there will be a lab on this where we will look at chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B, carotenoids, that kind of stuff. All right, now back to kind of light-dependent reaction. We need to start with that. The light-dependent reaction is going to be arranged in what we call photosystems. I already talked about this. There are two photosystems. Again, photosystem 2, photosystem 1. The purpose of the photosystem at first is to capture photons. So the pigments are arranged in what we call an antenna complex, and they capture photons. This would be chlorophyll pigments. This will be xenophil pigments, carotenoid pigments. And they, depending on the plant species again, how many of each you have really depends on the species of plant. But the purpose is for them to capture a photon and utilize that energy to excite electrons. So the energy, the resonant energy, is moved from one pigment molecule to the next until it reaches the reaction center. When it reaches the reaction center, it excites an electron. That electron can then be transferred to an electron acceptor or an electron carrier in some cases, and it's going to carry that electron to another region, another part of the thylakoid membrane. The excited electron, the electron that was excited by the photon energy, is replaced by the breaking of a water molecule. And we'll come back to this in a little bit. So this is kind of just an overview of photosystem 2 at first. Okay? Really all the photosystem 2 and 1 work fairly similar, except for the electron that's lost in photosystem 2 is donated by water. The electron in photosystem 1 comes from this electron. So just hang in there. I'll show you some more diagrams and whatnot. I just wanted to make sure to give you an overview of photosynthesis, why we see color, what are photons, what are the range that plants can pick up, and then what is a photosystem and what's the Calvin cycle and those kind of things, just in brief. Now we're going to go into the specifics of each photosystem and then specifically talk about the Calvin cycle. So, till next time,